Testing. Everybody, please find a seat and we'll get started in a moment. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our regular meeting of FoLA on this rather cool night. So it's good that you could come out. Welcome also to all those people who are watching the presentation tonight on live stream, and obviously whatever is live streamed is available on YouTube in a few days' time and will be there for quite a while. So before we get to our presentation here tonight, there's a couple other little announcements. I just want to promote again the annual research fellowship that's been advertised previously, and there'll probably be more details in the next FoLA newsletter. But we've had it going now for 2 years, and there's explanatory sheet plus an application form, and it's available from the Friends of Lutheran Archives website. And so anybody here, or if you know somebody or anybody watching live stream, or if they know somebody that might be interested, please consider this. There are terms and conditions and criteria for it, and we want the applications to be in by the end of October. So it's still a bit of time, but please think about it and promote it to people you think might be interested to get a benefit from this, to utilise the facilities at Lutheran Archives to help produce a presentation of some sort, or publication. Also, I'd also encourage people to renew your membership if you haven't done so yet, and also to people who are watching it live stream or on YouTube. It's important for us to maintain a healthy membership, because now that we're live streaming, it costs us a lot more than what our expenses were previously. And we also welcome new members. So if you'd like to become a member, see our treasurer down here and we can sort something out. And whilst we from time to time lose members because of age and death and so forth, we really need to keep on renewing our membership to keep our organisation viable. So before we go to our presentation for tonight, I'll ask Lois to speak to us about our meeting next month when we have an international guest.
Thank you, Jeff. Good evening. Yes, a rare privilege for us to have a guest coming all the way from Germany to speak to us. That is, he's coming to Australia because he loves Australia, and he's travelling around Australia. And while he was involved in visiting Australia, visiting Adelaide specifically, for a number of years, he is a young man, a teacher. By contrast to me, for example, he's a young man who was a teacher at a high school in Germany on Lake Constance, and he accompanied a group of students coming on an exchange here to South Australia, to Adelaide. And while his students were occupied at school, he was occupied in Lutheran Archives, investigating our history, and he became very interested in the history of the first Lutheran migration, the first German migration, the great Lutheran migration of the people we call generally Carvel's people, and to a degree also Fritsch's people who followed. And so he researched this story at our archives and then in numerous archives and libraries in Germany. And while working full-time as a teacher, he completed a PhD successfully at the University of Bamberg, and as German PhDs always are, it has been published as a book. Unfortunately, he cannot offer it to you unless you can read German. So we have an excellent book written by Dr. Johannes Bocksdörfer about the Carvel episode, let's say, as a migration story rather than as a story of church history, although the church history, of course, cannot be left out. And he found a lot of interesting material about the early Carvel's migration. Most Lutherans tend to think that they know all about it. The fact is we know very little generally, and he has put together a talk about Carvel's travels in 1835 and 1836, as he was looking for, having decided on immigration, looking for where he should take his people. Where should they go? So Johannes will be telling us about those travels. Where did Carvel go? We generally cover this in 2 sentences in our histories. He resigned, he went to Hamburg, they sent him to London. Full stop. Once he'd met Angus, the story was all over. Well, it might have been once he got to see Angus in London, but before that, whom did he visit? Why did he visit? Where did he go? What was he looking for? What questions was he asking? Who was he talking to? Above all, what was he looking for? What kind of a place did he want to bring his people to? And so it's a fascinating episode that we all think we know something about, and Johannes knows a lot more. So look forward to coming and seeing you at our next meeting here next month on August 29th, when he will just be at the end of a month-long tour of the country that he says is his happy land. So we will welcome him then. Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks, Lois. Imagine somebody else in this room trying to explain all that in such great detail. Thanks, Lois. Now I call on Shirley to introduce our speaker for tonight.
Thank you. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Valerie Volk to you, or I should really say Dr. Valerie Volk. Valerie has always been a closet writer, so after an academic background in English, history and education, when she retired from teaching and lecturing, she completed 2 long-held objectives, a PhD and then a master's degree in creative writing. Now she writes. In recent years, she has published several hundred award-winning poems and short stories in journals and anthologies, as well as 12 books, including historical fiction novels such as In Search of Anna, verse novels like A Promise of Peaches and Passion Play, and biblical fiction like Bystanders, which she wrote which was published in 2015, and Witnesses, published in 2023. She is well known for her poetry collections, like the Caleb Prize-winning In Due Season and Marking Time, as well as travel books. Her new book, the historical fiction novel Finding Emma, was released by Wakefield Press in March this year, March 2024. In her very limited spare time, she loves reading, film, and play-going, music, especially opera and jazz, travel and cooking, and the company of friends. But one of the greatest pleasures in her life is simply to write. Behind her, Valerie has generations of Lutheran background in Jindera, but was baptised, confirmed, taught Sunday school, and married in St John's Lutheran Church, Melbourne. She has taught in Lutheran schools in Melbourne, Brisbane, and Adelaide, and is currently a member of Emmanuel Lutheran Church, Nova Gardens. Please welcome Valerie Volk.
Well, thank you very much, Shirley, for that introduction. And thank you very much for coming out on this cold, cold night. I think you're all very stoic, and I'm glad that the church is heated enough for us to be comfortable anyway. It's a great pleasure to me always to talk to FoLA because, and this is, I think, the second, possibly the third time that I've done so, because I know that when I'm talking here, I'm talking to people who are on familiar territory in terms of our shared interests, in our background, in our family heritage, in the people whom we have known in the past and the places that we've known. So it's very familiar territory to all of us, and therefore a real pleasure to me to talk to a group where I know I'm on these sorts of familiar terms. The talk tonight, which is basically about my new book, but I want to go a lot further than that because of the sort of group that you are. Because you are interested in background and because you are interested in ancestors, I want to talk about the particular sort of book that this is, this book, Finding Emma. And it is, I would classify it as a work of faction. And I want to talk a bit more later about faction. However, to start, I would really like to introduce you to Emma. As I think you've probably been told, she's not a particularly likable person always, but she's always an interesting person. And I'm going to read the opening lines of the book to give you some idea of what I mean. Now, can you all hear me clearly enough from the back? It's okay? So I'm about to introduce Emma to you. And we find her at the opening of the book in her bedroom, a woman in her 70s, aging, like many of us are. And as she is in her bedroom talking to her granddaughter, or not talking to her granddaughter, she's somewhat irritated by the child who is looking at the big photograph on the wall, the wedding photo. And she says, the child asks her, "Why didn't you smile?" The child is staring at the big photograph on the bedroom wall. I note there is dust on the wooden curlicues of the frame. It annoys me. In that photo, she persists. I glance at the child. She is simply curious and insistent, not impertinent. Now she scrutinizes the picture that dominates the wall with its heavy carved frame. Her little red sandals are scuffed, the white ankle socks already brown with dirt. Playing outside, I decide. Why bother coming in here? Little girls should be seen and not heard, I say sharply. Joking is not my way. I do not like children, and I make no exceptions for my own grandchildren. I'm not a good grandmother. Why pretend to feelings you do not have? And you start thinking, who is this woman? I don't like the sound of this woman very much at all. And I've been intrigued by the number of people who've come back to me after reading the book saying, you know, I started out really not liking Emma at all, but by the end I had quite warmed to her. I'd come to understand her. And I guess that's partly what this book is about. Now, I said that this is a work of faction. Nope, that's gone a bit too far. We all know about fiction, the making up of stories. In fact, since Henry James wrote his famous work, The Art of Fiction, we've thought a lot about fiction. But faction is a term that's only become really popular or well-known in recent decades. And I think it probably started round about the time, and you probably remember this, Alex Haley writing a very famous book that became a television series called Roots, about his ancestors, the African-American slaves who came over, and particularly his own ancestor. Now, when that book came out and the TV series, eventually there were many complaints about it, people saying, this is not really the way it is. or was. And him saying, it's not meant to be. It's not a factual book, it is faction. And that started this great debate. What do we mean when we're talking about faction? And I think the simple definition that I put up there is probably quite an accurate one. It's a work that blends elements of fact and fiction in a seamless manner. And that is a point I want to make very, very strongly right away about this book, Finding Emma. It is a work of faction, not a book about facts, not a book about a real woman's real story. It's a fictional work based on fact. There's a real problem in writing faction. There are many, many things you've got to consider. If you're going to do a book which is faction, you have to accept the fact that, first of all, you have to decide, as any novelist does anyway, who the character is going to be, and you choose your character. And people have chosen characters from way back, you know, famous historical figures, kings and queens of the past, famous people of the past, and created faction books about them. You have to decide where you're going to place these people, where the setting is going to be. You have a lot of decisions to make that any novelist makes, but you're also circumscribed by the fact that you are writing based on fact, and therefore your problem is to find a setting, a person, whom you can find out enough about to make it authentic. And the problems of writing faction are very real ones, because you have to then invent motivations for them that people will think are realistic, even while you know that you have made these up. There are huge pitfalls in writing faction. One of the pitfalls is purely and simply that if your person lived not too long ago, you're going to find that there are other people around, as there were for Alex Haley, who say, that's not right, it's not the way that person was, it's not the way that situation was, you've got it wrong. And that is a pitfall for any writer of faction, because you are pretending that you know something that really you have made up. The pitfalls also have their other own problems. If you are writing about somebody or creating a character whose descendants are still around, or whose friends are still around, somebody is going to come back to you and say, you can't do that, you know, you can't make that person out to be like that. And I've been very careful in writing my own faction novels to run both books in manuscript form past descendants to check whether I'm going to embarrass or create resentment or hostility from somebody still alive who knew these people. But there are enormous possibilities as well, because you are giving these people a chance to come to life again. Maybe not quite the lives that they had, but they are going to be remembered in some way. And let's face it, I think we all want to be remembered in some way. We all like the idea of our legacy going on sometime into the future. So the two books, my two particular books, that I'm talking about tonight, or particularly the second one, both of these novels are faction novels. That first one, and I've spoken to you before about In Search of Anna, and I know many of you have read that book or know it. In Search of Anna, based very, very loosely on the story of my great-grandmother, who came to the Australian colonies in 1889 searching for her son, who'd gone missing somewhere in the colonies. A very ordinary woman in southern Germany from Silesia who packed herself up, got herself up by train and barge up to the shipyards of Bremen and Hamburg, got on one of the early steamships, got herself out to the colonies to search for this son who had gone missing. Now that's this first book, In Search of Anna. But that particular book is about a physical journey. Finding Emma is also a journey book, but a very different sort of journey. Finding Emma is again very loosely based on my grandmother, who was a woman who lived in Jindera. But the book, Finding Emma, is a psychological journey, not a physical one. She doesn't go very far at all. She moves very little distance from Jindera, the Albury area, around there, and her journey is a psychological journey into herself, trying to find out what has made her into the fairly cranky, somewhat embittered old woman she has become. So they're two journey books, but two very different sorts of journeys. I think one of the things about writing these books was trying to work out why I was doing it. What were these books really for? And this particular one, Finding Emma, as you see, the photograph on the wall at the side there was a photograph that triggered off this whole book. Just as finding the photograph of my great-grandmother, Anna, had triggered off that book. And in fact, at the start of Anna, there is in the prologue to that book an episode in which the writer stands looking at family photos on the wall, hunting for this woman, for Anna. And as she stands there looking at these photos, she realises that there are lots of others there with their own stories. And she passes some of these by, and I'm quoting now from the beginning of In Search of Anna, in that prologue, where the speaker says, "Here's an interesting face, my grandmother Emma. I study her, she stands, one hand resting lightly on Kurt's shoulder, looking at me to see what I make of it all. I shake my head. These two can wait. Their time is still to come. They are part of this story, and they will have their place, but not yet." Now, in a way, when I wrote those lines at the beginning of Anna, I was almost making a bit of a promise to myself that one day I would go back and I would write some of these other people, such as Emma. So in some ways, writing Finding Emma was fulfilling that implicit promise I'd made to myself. It was also in response to requests. A number of people who came to me and said, "I want to know more about some of those other people in these books. Why don't you write about them?" I guess I was flattered enough to want to do that. And I think the last part is my own personal involvement in my forebears, in my history, and in the places that they came from. When I was a child, and we lived in Melbourne as a child, and we often went to Jindera. I spent most of my school holidays in Jindera, and I knew the place relatively well. And I loved being there, but one of my chief delights there was to go to the two Lutheran churches, of course, to go there and to find there at the graveyards the graves of my forebears and my cousins and my distant relatives, and going back over the years, all of these people. I must have been a fairly morbid sort of a child. I think I loved graveyards, and I know there are many people here who love going, searching around graveyards. There's something of fascination about finding out about your past. So if you look at some of those graves there, which are from those cemeteries, those are the graveyards. That is the photograph that was the start of Finding Emma. You did warn me that this device was tricky. You were right. Right, writing anything of this sort, obviously in any book, the characters, the plot, these things are of central and critical importance. But there are other elements in writing any book that are equally important. And this mix of journaling and commentary is the basis of the style of writing Finding Emma. I think when you're writing fiction, you always have that problem of whose viewpoint are you telling the story from? And in this case, I took it from Emma's viewpoint. It's a first-person narrative, and she tells it herself. But she tells it in a mixture of journaling, going back over her journals, and commentary, so that you're moving backwards and forwards in time in this book, back to, in the early part of it, where she finds and reads and records and reminisces on the basis of the journals that she started to keep as a 9-year-old child. She goes back and starts looking at these only at the time when she has had, much, much later on, her first child. And as she's there, in that period of time, in that confinement time, what was called the lying-in period. And during that lying-in period, she stays there and she starts reading this old journal from that time. And as she reads as a 9-year-old, "I am writing my name on the first page. I will write it as carefully as I can because I want this to be a very special book. I'm 9 years old and the teacher tells me that my penmanship is very good. He has allowed me to put away the slate the others are still using, and I have a writing book with lines and a pen with a nib to dip in the inkwell." So you have this 9-year-old starting to keep a journal which becomes the practice right through her life. She writes in her journal, and only now, and years later, does she go back to investigate these journals and to find out a bit more about herself and what's made her what she is. The thing I must emphasize is that this is where we move into the realms of fiction. The real Emma, as far as I know, never kept a journal. So what I've done here is taken a fact, a woman who lived, and given her a fictional life through journals which she did not actually keep. So the style then is a mixture of journaling and her later on commentary, because she often reminisces as she reads through these old journals about the things that happened. You have 60 years of journaling being covered in this book. Don't worry, you don't read every single page of every journal, but you do get enough excerpts to get a sense of the passing of time. As I said, it's after the birth of her first child. When this lying in is over, and I am expected to take up life again, there will be no time for this. They think I sleep, but I spend many hours retracing my life, rediscovering myself through these journals. I have had them bring me the old chest where I keep them stored. They are mine and private. I keep the chest locked. They are my own key to finding myself and how I have come to be here in the big bed under the white ceiling with its black strips that hold the panels together, black lines on white. So that's where these reminiscences start as she looks back over the years of journaling. As well as the style of the writing, the other really critical thing, if you're writing fiction, is the setting, getting both the time and the place right. And I'm going to look briefly at these because I think for many of you, and I know there are many people here who have written family histories, you've certainly all explored your family histories, and I think there may even be some people who've tried writing fictional work based on these family histories. I won't ask you to show hands, but I'd be very interested to hear from you later if you have. But certainly, when you're exploring time and place, you have to try to get it right. And we're looking particularly in this book over a long period of time. 1867 is the year of birth for Emma, and the book follows through to the period at the beginning in the prologue of 1945. Now that's a long time, 78 years of change going on. It's a period of time when there was an apparent stability about life. You had, and you look at the top right-hand corner, Queen Victoria on the throne for most of those years, or many of them, 1837 to 1901, the longest reign up to Elizabeth that there had been for any monarch. a period that gave this impression of a stable background government there in England. But in the colonies, meanwhile, a period of fairly turbulent change, because it's the coming of the period of federation in 1901, and the disputes over, was it a good idea for the various Australian colonies to federate or not? And people, particularly in New South Wales, Emma's father, you find, talks about this and says, why would we want to give away the preeminence of New South Wales in the interests of joining with other colonies? You know, they're only going to take it away from us. So there was a lot of debate over federation, but of course it occurred. It's a period also of turbulence in other ways, a period of overseas wars, the Boer War and the number of Australians who went off to fight in South Africa, the turbulence of the two world wars, and the particular implications that they had in any German settlements like Jindera. A period of often discrimination, sometimes hostility, a period of time most people here will remember as having formed part of our history in Australia during those war years. Emma herself recognises that those war years were difficult ones for people. And she talks about the fact that in Jindera itself, she herself has felt the sort of discrimination that sometimes led to even internment of people. She says, will this terrible time never end? I come home from the post office, where the Mrs. Green, once so friendly, threw my letters to the front of the counter, where they fell to the floor, and turned away to talk together. I heard the word traitor, and I fled. To be so thought of when I have worked hard in making jams and preserves for the Red Cross sales, when I have knitted socks and balaclavas till my fingers were stiff, when I have organised concerts to raise funds for the war effort. It is hard. Our local newspapers accuse us of all sorts of things. A letter to the editor accused good old Herr Closey, as upright and loyal a man as you could find, of spitting on a Union Jack flag, and Karl Bergmann's son of being a German spy because his father's wife had returned to Germany so many years earlier. It's a period that our forefathers lived through, those two episodes of World War, which led to a lot of grief, a lot of heartache for people, a lot of misery, a period of time when photos of the Kaiser had to be put away and hidden because the people who came in to search the house would have seen that as a sign of treachery and disloyalty. And Emma goes through and lives many of those episodes through the journals that she now rediscovers. And of course, with the Second World War particularly, the first one too, the return of servicemen, and Emma and her family again go through that. It's the opening up of the country during that period that is especially important, with the development of steam, the development of railways, the opening up of places, greater access to travel from place to place, and even on the domestic front, the transition from the old horse and buggy days to the new forms of transport that developed. I got particularly interested in the development of the bicycle and the move through from the big old penny farthings to the more modern forms of bicycle. And in the case of Emma and her own family, her very strong-willed daughter, Joanna, is determined that one day in the near future, she is going to have a bicycle and ride it. And she's going to have the right clothing for that bicycle as well. And it's probably too small to see, but on the bottom right-hand picture there, anybody recall the days of the knickerbockers and the big special costumes for ladies riding bicycles? But it wasn't quite as simple as that, because in fact the bicycle was seen with great disapproval by some people. And Emma's very straight-laced, prim and proper sister, Christina, who lives with them, is horrified when the child comes and says she's going to ride a bicycle one day. And she says to her sister, you wouldn't really let your child do that, would you? Ride a bicycle? And Emma, who's quite progressive, says, well, you know, why not? And Christiana is quite embarrassed by this conversation. She says, but, you know, I've heard it can do terrible things to them. And Emma's not quite clear what she means. Christiana says, I have read that when ladies ride on these contraptions, they can be morally corrupted. Oh, says Emma, what do you mean? And Christiana is really embarrassed now. They say that the bicycle seat between a lady cyclist's legs can create sensations that no unmarried woman should feel. And Emma is truly amazed that Christiana's thoughts have run along those directions. So it's not only things like the bicycle, it's the coming of all these other things, like the coming of sulkies. I wonder how many of you can remember sulkies in your family background. Those 1 or 2 horse contraptions, lightweight. Emma's father buys a sulky, and the family are delighted. Fatih is buying a sulky for us to use. He has become interested in these new contraptions, and we have all looked at the pictures. It seems almost too fragile with its light carriage and the horse between 2 shafts at the front. Some even have a shade over them for sunny or inclement weather, and the high padded seats may be for 1 or 2 passengers. Such an odd name, but it seems the inventor was a man well known for his wish to travel alone, a sulky man, they say, and so his vehicle was called a sulky. Logical, isn't it? Till I started my research, I hadn't realised that was where the name came from. But it's an age of great technological expansion in all sorts of ways. You live through her journals, the coming of cars. Kurt, her husband, is fascinated by steam and steam engines, and of course when the car comes along, he's interested particularly in this. Kurt is fascinated by the new transport that is becoming so popular. When he first heard that steam had been used for a road vehicle, he was impressed beyond measure. Emma herself doubts that steam and this car will ever replace horses, but she has to eat her words a few years later. I was wrong. Only last week we went to observe a parade of the new vehicles in Albury. They took the length of Dean Street with the new petrol-driven tourers that wealthy people are buying. She's still dubious, but Kurt tells her about the T model, which costs under £1,000 in America. She points out, no, he reassured her. Mr. Ford is producing so many of these on an assembly line that they will spread throughout the world. There is a dealer in Port Melbourne who's been bringing them here for the past 5 years. So you follow through these transport changes, the gradual move into aeroplanes, all of this as she lives it through her journals. I'm almost tempted to ask you if you... let me go again. The changes in agriculture, I think we all know pretty much the sorts of things that happened there with new machinery, new equipment, new crop methods. All of this, these changing times, are an important part of the authentic background of this work of faction. The economic rises and falls, particularly things like the Great Depression. Now, Emma becomes very involved in all of this because her husband and his fascination with steam have led him to establish a blacksmith shop in Jindera. And it becomes a very successful blacksmith shop with a large number of men working for it. At one period, about 18 men were working for it and a number of forgers, while he himself goes off quite often working on steam engines, on the paddle steamers, on the Murray, and on other farms. But she therefore becomes very interested in the management side of the business and takes quite a bit of responsibility for it. So she learns to follow things like the ups and downs of depressions and the effect that these will have on the farming communities. All of this she records in the journal. Also that period of a changing labour market with the forming of unions and the beginning of strikes. And her father is very appalled by the fact that people could dream of joining together and striking against their employers. But the changing times also encompassed social life and the roles of women, which changed so enormously with wars and the new employment possibilities there. The suffragette movement, and again, predictably, Emma's father is appalled the idea of a woman chaining herself to fence posts and to places where they will have to cut her free and remove her and force feed her in hospitals. The stories of the suffragettes that he hears about strike him with horror. Changes in the homes. The period I remember as a child at my grandfather's being given a candle in a candlestick to take to bed with me to the bedrooms. The gradual coming of lanterns, of oil lamps, the move into gas lights, and eventually the coming of electricity. All of these changes we live through in this work of faction as authentically as we can. The entertainment, which moved from things like the traditional sing-alongs around the piano, the card notes and so on, the coming of the phonograph. You see the one in the bottom right-hand corner there. Those machines for the cylindrical wax discs and the big horn that blared out the music of the time. The community life that developed during that period. The village brass bands, the coming of libraries, card nights, all of this. Emma lives through all of these things in this book. I think that would help. I'll try that next time. We move on further with finding the place for this. And that's a scene that I think many of you will have seen reproduced in various books. While in South Australia, the emphasis here was on the Barossa, on Hahndorf, on all of this area. In New South Wales, the emphasis historically was on the coming of these people across the trek along the Murray, the 6-week trek that they took on, mainly because the land was running out for younger sons in the Barossa Valley. And the people who had established their own farms were finding it difficult to expand any further for the rest of the family. And so they sent off the scouts to the Riverina area where they'd heard land was opening up with the Settlement Acts, the Settlers Acts there, and there would be the chance of buying land more cheaply there than anywhere else. And they came back with reports this was indeed so. And whole groups of people got together, particularly in the 1860s, formed their wagon trains and set off on this almost exodus-like journey along the Murray, travelling around about 6 weeks it took them from many of the old family records that I've read, stopping always on Sunday for a day of rest and a day of religious observance, stopping at night, gathering the wagons together in a circle, always for devotion, and the devotion books and the hymns that were sung are interesting. No, it doesn't seem to make... Oh, there we go. Eventually, they came along from Albury, set off from Albury, 9 miles northwest, and established this little township of Jindera. It was already there, Dites Forest it was called in those days, and how the name came to be changed to Jindera there are many different stories about. But they established it with this German influx, joining the people who were already there and creating almost a sort of a small mirror German-type town. They came, as I said, basically for economic and social reasons, just as they had come for religious reasons from Germany, many of them to South Australia. They brought these same religious reasons and these same religious divisions with them to Jindera. So just as their first buildings were the log huts to live in, the schoolhouse and the churches were not just one, but the two church, the UELCA and the ELCA. And you see at the bottom there, the old churches in Jindera, the UELCA church and the ELCA, because they brought those same religious divisions with them as they came. And they made it into almost a German-type village. Land was set aside in 1867 and was taken up rapidly. It grew during the 1870s, and just a quick scanning down the sorts of facilities that developed during those years. And as you research them, you discover just how many of those industries, buildings came as the time went by. Things like the coming of the bushfire brigade, the dressmakers, the racetrack and the park, all of these establishing for them a genuinely community-based life, but always with the church, the family and the school as the centre. And Jindera today is almost like a satellite town of Albury. People live in Jindera, commute into Albury quite often for work period. Population of over 2,500 people and building going on all the time. So the time and the place setting of this book were crucially important in the writing of it. That's the factual background. But it's a work of faction. Where does the fictional element come in? There was indeed a woman. This is not a biography of this woman. The photos are authentic enough. She really did live, and many of the events that are described are events that did happen to her. But there is also the fact that she's an invented character, a fictional character, and the personal parts of it, the feelings, the emotions, all of this, these are invention. I used old photographs as an entry into this world, but while the photographs are here, and these people did exist, the feelings I've attributed to them are a novelist's creation. A key part of the early part of this book is based on this story, and there is an element of fact in this story. The story of a minor German noble, a count, a Graf, who came to Jindera in the period of Emma's life, the Graf Kurt zu Stolberg. Family story has it that he fell in love with Emma and she with him. Passionately in love, the two of them. She was in her late teens, he was in his mid-20s. They became engaged, the banns were called in the church, the wedding was set up. 2 weeks before the wedding, he contracted typhoid and diphtheria and died in Albury Hospital. Emma was distraught. Now, I don't know how deeply it affected her. There is a family story that for the rest of her life, she took flowers to his grave in the Jindera cemetery every week. That, I think, is factual. But what impact this had on her life is where I turn the story into total fiction, because the impact that it had and the way in which it bedeviled the rest of her life and made it difficult for her to form a good relationship with somebody else afterwards, that's where we move into the realms of complete creative fiction. Maybe do, maybe not. Certainly his grave is there, and anybody who wants to check it out can go and see the grave of the Graf Kurt zu Stolberg. She did, however, go on and married this man, and that is an authentic photo of their wedding. And this man, in the book, who is given the name of Kurt, is the Kurt that we meet in Search of Anna, the son whom Anna came searching for all the way from Germany. He did, and this is where old photos again have proved so useful, he did establish a blacksmith shop, and that's it there. You can see it on the left-hand side. And the house that he built for her when they married, and it was round about 9 years after the death of the the German count she was engaged to. So there was quite a considerable period between. She certainly didn't leap into a second relationship. The house that he built for her was that house there, which was a fairly simple and primitive dwelling, as you can see. But as the years went on, it developed further. The blacksmith shop grew bigger. It employed many more people. And the house also developed. House is still there today. You can drive through Jindera today. The blacksmith shop is gone. You can still see it there on the left in the photo, but the house is still there and is still inhabited today. Emma's life went on, and the rest of this book and the journals that she keeps take you through the next decades of her life, with all its ups and downs. Her marriage, the relationship between them, the impact that her first love had on her, the way it affected the rest of her life, and her relationships not just with her husband, but with her children. But Emma, the real Emma, the factual Emma, in about her 40s there, and in old age there with her husband. The photographs were my triggers for the story I invented. And this is where we come to, I suppose, one of the questions about writing fiction. How much right do you have to do this sort of thing with people's lives, to reinvent them and to make them into something totally different from what they might have really been? And I guess this sort of reinterpreting of lives is what I find one of the most fascinating things about being a writer, that you have the freedom to do this creative act and to make something different out of what it might have really been like. It's a difference between, I was trying to think of what Trump would have said about it, but I don't want to get involved in that, between truth. It's the old statement, there are lies, damned lives, and statistics. In this case, it's a matter of truth. What is truth? There's an imaginative truth. And a writer is trying to create imaginative truth about these people. What could their lives have been like? Not necessarily what were they like, but what might they have been like? And that's the fascinating thing about writing. You have the freedom to reinvent and to do this. You have the freedom, but then I'm always left with the niggling question, is there somewhere out there my great-grandfather looking down on me and saying, you could not have done this, you should not have done this? It's the difference between being a novelist and being a historian. I make no pretense to being a historian. I love doing the research. I love finding out about the times. I love finding out about the places. But I love the freedom to be able to do what I want to with the people, and that's where the novelist part of it comes in. So those of you who have family histories that fascinate you might well like to go back and think, what if? What could I do with this person? What could I make out of this person's life? And once you start doing that, you too are writing fiction. Emma herself changes during the course of this book. And towards the end of the book, and I'd like to pick it up there for a moment, just before I move to the end, the time sequence has been enormous. It has taken you through from the 1860s to the 1940s. You get to know her through the journals as a child and the things that have happened to her there. You get to know her as a young woman in love. You get to know her through her marriage, through the years in which she has 4 children. You get to know her through her daughters. And she comes to know herself a bit better as she goes back through the journals. She says, It was the year of Joanna's birth that I first went back to the journals, for during that period of lying in, I started the journey into my past. The idea pleases me now that I think of it, a journey through the journals. Not always pleasant reading, in fact, most often not, for I do not really like the woman I am finding. Yet I have to learn acceptance, even though the years to come show me even less pleasant memories. And some of those years to come, as the decades roll on, are less pleasant memories, personal ones for her. But as you move towards the end of the book, and the last journal entries that she makes, she says that she would like to give these journals one day to her granddaughter, that granddaughter we met at the beginning of the book with her little red shoes and her white grubby-looking socks. And she tells Kurt, her husband, that one day she would like to give these journals to this child. I'd like her to have the journal sometime later on. I've spent a lot of time rereading them and trying to understand. Understand what, my dear? Me, you, our lives, everything. What did you find? I don't like myself at all. I don't like what I've done to other people, especially to you. You don't really know me, and I don't think I want you to. He did not rush to answer. I feared what he might say. He is kind, but he is honest. Emma, my love, I do know you. I know you much better than you think. No, you don't. I have done so many things in my life that make me ashamed. You don't know many of them. He would not let me continue. You are too hard on yourself. You always have been. Somewhere along the way you learned guilt, and you've lived with it all your life. Forgive yourself. I don't want you to see me as I really am. I want to be the person you say you see. Emma, I love you. I always have. I always will. Nothing will change that. I know I've always shared you, and I accepted that from the start. But you are the center of my life, and that's just the way it is. And because Kurt is the sort of generous and compassionate man that he is, it enables her to, right at the very end of the book, do what she has not been able to really do, realize that she does love him as much as she has ever loved anybody else in her early life. And the last lines of the book make this very clear. And I'm reading from the very end. Now I look again at that wedding photograph and wish that I had smiled. When Kurt comes to me, as he will, to see if I've finished writing, I will put this book in the chest with the others. I know I can smile at him as I should have smiled on that wedding day. And so we've come full circle back to the photograph of the early part of the book. So I went away from writing this book with a few questions to myself. What is it really about? Why did I write it? What have I learned in writing this book? And I came to perhaps those three things. That it's important to learn what has shaped us, particularly as we get older, to look back and to find out how it is that we've become the people that we are. The dangers of not letting go of the past, which is what Emma has for so long not been able to do. And losing sight of what is really valuable, how to live your life and not waste it. And they were for me the three lessons that I took away from writing this book. And I rather like that quotation from Aristotle, knowing yourself is the beginning of wisdom, because that's what Emma ultimately has to do to come to know herself. And that's why the book is called Finding Emma. I hope that if you read the book, you might find Emma for yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Valerie. Now, is there any questions or comments from anybody here? I hope you're still awake. Okay. Yes, Helen?
Valerie, were you aware of the true relationship between your grandmother and your grandfather at the end of their lives? No, you made that up too. I would just like to say that when my husband David had to edit Like a Bird on the Wing, the story of, oh, what's her name now? Sorry? Louise Homan, yes. Most of it was fact, but she insisted on the ending being a happy ending, and apparently Louise was rather embittered at the end of her life, very sad at the end of her life, and that was something that my husband struggled with as an editor. He couldn't persuade the author to change that a more factual ending would have been proper, but maybe he hadn't got into faction as well as fiction at that time. Thank you. It's been very interesting listening to you.
Just following on from Helen's question, no, I didn't really know my grandparents very well. I was a much, much younger child, and I really don't know what the relationship between them was. I have fond memories of him, some of which I've drawn on in the book, with the story of Kurt as a grandfather and Ada. Some of that is based on truth, but what the relationship between them was, pure invention. And if you read the book, keep that in mind. This picture of the woman that you're getting may be totally different from the woman as she was. Colleen, do you remember her at all? No. We share a bit of Jindera background, and that's what I wondered.
Okay, any other comments? Yes, Bethany?
You mentioned, I think, that the journals are all made up, but did you have any other samples of her writing, any letters or anything like that to base the style on, or was it all pure invention?
Okay, any other questions? If not, I'll call on Margaret Modra to move a vote of thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Valerie. I have read the book. I've read the previous Anna one. What was especially interesting for me was finding Emma, and I don't think you actually mentioned in your talk what her maiden name was. She was Emma Werner, and my grandmother was Emma Werner. But she was in Victoria. But you are such a gifted writer, and I have really enjoyed, I'm not sure how many of your books I've read, but a lot of them. And they are just so interesting. And even though these events happened before I came along in the world, I can still relate to some from what my grandparents have told me. So thank you very much, Valerie, that you've come along tonight to share this with us. And I hope that all of you will buy lots of books, because they are so beautifully written. And you just feel yourself as though you were part of the life story of Emma and also of Anna, so buy both books. But there are some other ones as well. So again, thank you very much, Valerie. And I think, yes. That's one. Oops, and there's a second. Two, yeah.
Thank you, that's very generous of you, thanks.
Good, thank you. I must say that Valerie's a very brave person to write faction. You know, I've written quite a few books, and you have to be really careful when you sort of write histories to make sure you get facts right. So to turn it into a novel is quite an art to do that. So well done. Now, as you came in tonight, you would have seen a table out there of Valerie's books. I think there's 14 of them. They're all priced, and finding Emma, is that the one? Yeah. That's $33 out there. So if you see the people out there to have a look through the various large and smaller books, you're most welcome to make a purchase and read it and find it as intriguing as what Margaret said. So thank you all for coming here tonight. I know it's a bit of a cool night out there. You're all welcome to stay for supper over in the church hall, and we welcome you all to come back next month when we have a guest speaker from Germany who speaks good English, I presume. Yes? Good. So that's another exciting development for us to have an international guest next month. So thank you all for coming, and please enjoy what still remains of tonight. Oh, okay, at a price? Okay, so Valerie's quite happy to autograph books for you, so maybe if you sit out there for a few minutes, you might get the cramp from signing your name so many times. So thank you all for coming. Enjoy the supper, and certainly have a look at the publications that are out there, and they've all been written by Valerie. Thank you.